The dangerous thing about quiet women, Eleanor Sterling said with a soft laugh while lifting her champagne glass, is that people mistake silence for weakness. The private conference room overlooking downtown Manhattan filled with polite laughter immediately after she spoke, the kind wealthy families used when they wanted humiliation to feel sophisticated instead of cruel. Celeste Harper sat across the polished walnut table without reacting. Her hands rested calmly beside the divorce papers while rain streaked slowly across the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. Outside, the city glowed silver beneath the late evening storm, but inside the Sterling family office, everything felt warm, expensive, and intentionally controlled. Graham Sterling loosened the cuff of his tailored navy suit before sliding the final document toward her with detached confidence. "You can keep the apartment for another 60 days, he said evenly. "After that, the property transfers fully back to the family trust." Celeste lowered her eyes briefly toward the paper. No argument, no anger. That seemed to disappoint his mother more than anything else. Eleanor Sterling leaned back in her chair beside the fireplace, diamonds catching the amber light. "Honestly, Celeste, this is probably for the best," she said smoothly. "The Sterling world was always going to be too demanding for someone like you." Another small wave of restrained laughter moved around the room. Graham's younger sister Vanessa glanced down at her phone, barely hiding her amusement. Two attorneys sat silently near the end of the table, pretending not to notice the tension unfolding in front of them. Celeste finally picked up the pen. Graham watched her carefully now. For 3 years he had expected emotional reactions from her whenever pressure entered a room. Frustration, tears, long conversations about loyalty and marriage and sacrifice. But tonight something felt different. Too calm, too distant. Almost like she had already left before arriving. "That is it?" Vanessa asked with a smirk. "No dramatic speech? No last-minute begging?" Graham shot his sister a quick glance, though he did not stop her. Celeste signed the first page slowly and neatly. The scratching sound of the pen against paper somehow felt louder than the storm outside. One signature, then another. Eleanor smiled into her champagne again. "Well," she said lightly, "at least she is making this easy." But one of the attorneys briefly looked up from the documents toward Celeste with faint curiosity instead of pity. Because people usually did not leave marriages like this without fear in their eyes. Especially not marriages tied to old money, private clubs, Manhattan penthouses, and generational influence. Celeste finished signing the final page and slid the folder calmly across the table. Graham exhaled quietly, almost relieved. "Thank you," he said. Celeste looked at him fully for the first time that evening. "You are welcome." Her voice remained soft, controlled, impossible to read. Eleanor set down her glass. "You know," she added with casual cruelty, "most women would have fought harder before walking away from this kind of life." Celeste stood slowly from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her black coat before answering. "Most women probably would." Silence touched the room for half a second. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Calm, certain, like someone leaving a meeting instead of losing a future. Graham noticed it too, and for reasons he could not explain, the feeling unsettled him. Celeste reached for her purse near the edge of the table, but before turning toward the door, her eyes drifted briefly toward the oil painting hanging above the fireplace. A rare 19th century piece the Sterling family often bragged about during charity galas and investor dinners. "Strange collection," she said quietly. Eleanor frowned slightly. "Excuse me." Celeste tilted her head almost thoughtfully while studying the painting one last time. "Nothing," she replied. "I was just wondering how much longer your family will be able to keep it." The room went completely still. Graham's expression tightened instantly. Vanessa lowered her phone. Even the attorneys exchanged a quick glance across the table. But Celeste simply offered a polite smile before walking toward the exit in black heels that echoed softly against the marble floor. No anger, no tears, no final argument. Just quiet footsteps disappearing beyond the Sterling office doors while thunder rolled low above Manhattan, and, for the first time that night, nobody inside the room seemed interested in laughing anymore. By the following Monday morning, the Sterling family had already turned the divorce into entertainment. Eleanor Sterling hosted a private brunch on the Upper East Side, where crystal glasses clinked beneath soft piano music, while wealthy women discussed Celeste Harper the same way people discussed unfortunate weather. "She handled it better than expected," one woman admitted while stirring cream into her coffee. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That is because she still believes dignity pays bills." Quiet laughter circled the table again. Across Manhattan, inside the 43rd floor executive office of Sterling Group, Graham stood near the windows reviewing numbers that refused to improve no matter how long he stared at them. The skyline stretched endlessly beneath gray clouds, but the city no longer felt as stable as it once had. Two senior investors had delayed renewal discussions. One development project in Miami had suddenly stalled after financing complications. Even worse, several private accounts connected to the company had been quietly closed over the weekend without explanation. Graham loosened his tie slightly, while his chief financial officer shifted nervously across from him. "We are still tracing where the capital moved," the man explained carefully. But whoever reorganized those accounts understood the system extremely well. Graham frowned. "You are telling me someone removed nearly $30 million without triggering alerts?" "Not removed," the executive corrected softly. "Redirected." Graham turned fully now. "To where?" The man hesitated. "We still do not know." That answer irritated Graham more than he wanted to admit. Sterling Group had survived recessions, lawsuits, political shifts, and market crashes because the family controlled information before problems became public. But this felt different. Invisible. Precise. Controlled by someone patient enough to move quietly. Meanwhile, nearly 600 miles away in Chicago, Celeste stepped into a private art restoration warehouse near the riverfront while cold winds swept between the industrial buildings outside. The space looked ordinary from the street, almost forgotten, but inside, millions of dollars in paintings, sculptures, and rare collections rested beneath museum lighting and climate-controlled glass. A tall, silver-haired man in a charcoal suit approached her immediately the moment she entered. "Miss Harper," he said respectfully. "The Zurich transfer finalized this morning." Celeste removed her gloves slowly while studying a covered painting near the center platform. "Any complications?" "None." The man paused briefly before adding, "though several Sterling accounts attempted to access the old structure after midnight." Celeste showed no visible reaction. "And the firewall held." A faint smile touched her face for less than a second. "Good." The man handed her a black folder embossed with gold lettering. "There is one more thing. The Harrington Auction Committee confirmed attendance from nearly every major East Coast collector." Celeste opened the folder carefully. Inside rested a formal invitation printed on thick ivory paper beneath the emblem of Harrington International Auctions, one of the most exclusive financial and art events in America. Billionaires attended quietly. Old money families treated invitations like social currency. Entire corporate empires sometimes rose or collapsed over conversations held during cocktails beneath those chandeliers. Celeste read the date once before closing the folder again. "Will the Sterling family attend?" she asked calmly. "Yes." The silver-haired man adjusted his glasses. In fact, Graham Sterling personally requested front table placement. For the first time all morning, amusement flickered quietly through Celeste's eyes. Outside the warehouse windows, snow began falling lightly across the Chicago streets, while somewhere far away in Manhattan, Graham Sterling stared at another collapsing financial report. Without realizing the woman his family laughed about over brunch was already standing 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. 3 weeks later, Graham Sterling realized wealthy people only sounded calm when they still believed they were in control. The emergency board meeting started at 8:30 sharp inside the Sterling Tower Executive Conference Room, but by 9:15, every polished sentence in the room had started cracking beneath pressure. "The banks are nervous," one board member admitted while sliding a report across the table. "They are asking questions about liquidity exposure." Graham remained standing near the screen, displaying financial projections that looked worse every hour. "Temporary panic," he replied firmly. "Once the Harrington acquisition closes, confidence returns immediately." Across the table, Eleanor Sterling adjusted the pearl bracelet around her wrist with visible irritation. "Then stop delaying it," she snapped. "Your father built this company by acting before weakness became public." Graham did not answer immediately, because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Sterling Group needed the Harrington auction more than anyone outside the room understood. Officially, the event was about rare art and elite collectors. Unofficially, it was where billion-dollar partnerships quietly formed between old money families who trusted reputation more than contracts. If Graham secured the Rothwell painting during the auction, investors would interpret it as proof the Sterling family remained financially untouchable. Without it, rumors would spread fast enough to destroy years of carefully protected status. "The painting matters," Graham finally said. "Everyone important will be there." One older board member frowned, including people who already heard the rumors. Silence followed immediately after that sentence. Not loud silence. The dangerous kind wealthy people created when nobody wanted to say the worst thing out loud. Meanwhile, across Chicago, Celeste Harper stood alone inside a private showroom, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers above the marble gallery floor. Evening light reflected against glass display cases filled with historic jewelry, rare watches, and investment-grade art waiting to be transported to Harrington. International auctions. A young assistant approached, carefully holding a tablet. Miss Harper, the Sterling family confirmed final attendance this afternoon. Celeste studied the painting in front of her without looking away. Which table? Front row, directly beside the Rothwell placement. A faint smile touched her lips. Of course. The assistant hesitated before speaking again. There is another issue. Several collectors requested a private introduction to you before the event. Celeste finally turned toward her now. Denied. Politely. Celeste nodded once before walking slowly through the gallery beneath the warm golden lights. Her black heels echoed softly against polished stone while museum staff quietly stepped aside without being asked. The assistant watched her carefully for a moment before speaking again in a lower voice. May I ask something personal? Celeste stopped near the far display window overlooking the snowy Chicago skyline. You may ask. The assistant hesitated. Why let them underestimate you for so long? Outside, headlights moved slowly beneath falling snow while silence settled gently between them. Then Celeste answered without emotion. Because arrogant people reveal everything when they think you are powerless. Back in Manhattan, Graham entered his penthouse after midnight with exhaustion written across his face. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows, but even the view felt colder now. His phone buzzed immediately the moment he loosened his tie. Vanessa Sterling's name flashed across the screen. You need to see this, she said the second he answered. Mom is furious. Graham walked toward the kitchen. About what? Someone bought the Henderson collection this afternoon. He frowned slightly. So? Vanessa lowered her voice. The buyer used Harper Holdings. Graham stopped walking instantly. Silence filled the line for nearly 3 seconds. Then he laughed once under his breath, though the sound carried no real amusement. That is impossible, he said quietly. Celeste does not have that kind of money. But even as he said it, something uncomfortable moved quietly through his chest. Because for the first time, since the divorce, Graham Sterling realized he had absolutely no idea what his ex-wife was truly capable of anymore. The Harrington International auction looked less like a public event and more like a private kingdom built for people rich enough to treat ordinary luxury as background decoration. Crystal chandeliers hung above the grand ballroom like frozen light, while waiters in white gloves moved silently between collectors, investors, politicians, and old money families whose last names carried more influence than most corporations. Soft classical music floated through the room beneath the low murmur of billion-dollar conversations disguised as polite small talk. Graham Sterling adjusted the sleeve of his black tuxedo while stepping through the entrance beside Eleanor and Vanessa. Almost immediately, people turned toward them with carefully controlled smiles. Some offered greetings. Others offered sympathy disguised as networking. Wealthy rooms rarely attacked directly. They observed weakness quietly until the right moment arrived. Smile. Eleanor whispered sharply beneath her breath. If people smell desperation tonight, we are finished. Graham kept his expression calm even though tension had already settled heavily across his shoulders. Everywhere he looked, he saw power. Oil executives, hedge fund founders, luxury developers, families whose names appeared on museum walls and university buildings. The kind of people who could erase a company without ever raising their voices. Mr. Sterling, a silver-haired investor approached with a champagne glass in hand. I heard you are pursuing the Rothwell tonight. Graham forced an easy smile. We are considering it. The man nodded slowly, though his eyes carried curiosity instead of confidence. Competition may be stronger than expected. Before Graham could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance subtly shifted the atmosphere across the room. Not loudly, just enough for conversations to soften. Several collectors turned at once. A museum director standing near the center staircase straightened immediately. Even one of the auction executives abandoned an important conversation mid-sentence. Vanessa frowned. Slightly. Who is that? Graham followed the movement toward the entrance and felt his chest tighten instantly. Celeste Harper stepped into the ballroom wearing a fitted black evening gown with no visible jewelry except a single diamond bracelet beneath the soft chandelier light. Her hair rested neatly over one shoulder, while her expression remained calm, unreadable, almost detached from the attention spreading quietly through the room around her. But it was not her appearance that unsettled Graham. It was everyone else. A billionaire hotel owner crossed the room to greet her personally. 2 major collectors nodded respectfully as she passed. One older man Graham recognized from Forbes magazine actually stood up from his table when Celeste approached nearby. Eleanor stared openly now. What exactly is this? She whispered. Celeste accepted a champagne glass from a waiter before exchanging a few quiet words with the museum director beside the staircase. The man laughed softly at something she said, though there was clear respect beneath the warmth. Graham noticed it immediately. Respect wealthy people reserved for equals. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. She probably knows someone here. But even she no longer sounded convinced. Across the ballroom, Celeste finally noticed the Sterling family watching her. For one brief moment, her eyes met Graham's directly through the sea of chandeliers and designer gowns. No anger, no sadness, no attempt to impress him. Somehow that made the moment worse. Graham stepped toward her instinctively, adjusting his jacket as if confidence alone could restore balance to the room. "Celeste," he said once he reached her, "I did not expect to see you here." She turned toward him fully now, her expression calm beneath the golden lights. "Neither did I," she answered softly. Eleanor approached beside him with forced politeness stretched tightly across her face. "You never mentioned an interest in art auctions." Celeste lifted her champagne slightly. "There are many things your family never asked about." Silence touched the small circle around them immediately. Nearby guests pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Graham studied her carefully now, not because she looked different, because she looked comfortable here. Too comfortable. Like someone who belonged among people powerful enough to change entire industries over dinner conversations. Then an auction executive suddenly appeared beside Celeste with visible urgency. "Miss Harper," the man said respectfully, "the committee is ready for you whenever you are prepared." Graham's expression hardened slightly. "Committee?" The executive glanced between them before answering carefully. "Miss Harper has been expected for some time." And for the second time that month, Graham Sterling realized he was standing in a room where his ex-wife understood far more than he did. The ballroom lights dimmed gradually as the first phase of the Harrington auction began, and within seconds, the entire atmosphere shifted from elegant conversation to controlled financial warfare. Rows of collectors settled into velvet chairs beneath glowing chandeliers, while assistants moved discreetly through the aisles carrying tablets and champagne. At the center stage, a massive screen illuminated the opening collection in soft gold light, while the auctioneer adjusted his cufflinks beneath the attention of the most powerful people in the room. Graham Sterling sat at the front table beside Eleanor and Vanessa with forced confidence tightening every movement he made. Across the aisle, Celeste Harper sat alone at a reserved table marked only with a small silver plaque that read H, Collection Division. No family name. No explanation. Somehow that silence around her identity felt more intimidating than status ever could. Who exactly invited her? Vanessa whispered sharply. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. "I intend to find out." The first several items sold quickly. Rare sculptures, historical manuscripts, jewelry once owned by European royalty. Tens of millions of dollars exchanged hands with little more than raised fingers and calm nods. But Graham barely noticed any of it. His attention kept drifting toward Celeste. She never tried to dominate the room, never tried to appear important. Yet people continued approaching her between lots with unmistakable respect. "Hey!" Technology billionaire stopped to greet her personally. A museum chairman shook her hand before returning to his seat. Even members of the Harrington Executive Committee seemed strangely attentive whenever she spoke. None of it made sense. Then the lights softened again. The auctioneer smiled toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly, "our next piece represents one of the rarest acquisitions in private circulation. Rothwell's Winter Beneath Ashes." The massive screen behind him illuminated with the image of the painting immediately. A quiet ripple moved through the ballroom. Even seasoned collectors leaned forward slightly now. The Rothwell was legendary, not just because of artistic value, but because ownership of the piece carried enormous social influence among East Coast investment circles. Graham felt tension tighten across his chest instantly. This was the moment he came for. Beside him, Eleanor lowered her voice carefully. "Do not lose that painting." Graham gave a faint nod without looking away from the stage. The auctioneer continued smoothly. "Opening bid begins at $20 million. A paddle lifted almost immediately from the second row. 22. Another voice followed calmly. 25. The numbers climbed quickly beneath the crystal chandeliers while assistants moved through the aisles recording bids with controlled efficiency. Graham finally lifted his own paddle. 30 million. Several heads turned subtly toward the Sterling table. Good. That was exactly what he wanted. Confidence. Visibility. Strength. Across the aisle, Celeste remained completely still, one hand resting lightly against the stem of her champagne glass, while the bidding continued rising. 32. 34. 36. Graham raised his paddle again. 40 million. Silence touched the room briefly after that number. The auctioneer smiled carefully. $40 million from Mr. Sterling. Graham finally allowed himself to breathe slightly. This was the image investors needed to see. Control restored publicly in front of the financial elite. Then a calm voice drifted softly across the ballroom. 50 million. Every sound inside. The room seemed to disappear at once. Graham turned immediately toward Celeste. She had not even lifted her voice. She simply sat beneath the golden chandelier light with her paddle lowered again, as if the bid meant nothing at all. Vanessa stared openly now. Eleanor's face hardened instantly. Nearby collectors exchanged quick glances across their tables. $50 million was no longer art collecting. That was power signaling. Graham forced a controlled smile despite the pressure building inside him. $55 million, he answered firmly. The auctioneer repeated the number while tension quietly spread through the ballroom. All eyes shifted toward Celeste again. She tilted her head slightly toward the stage before speaking once more without visible emotion. $70 million. This time the silence felt heavier. Not shocked. Calculating. Wealthy people recognizing another wealthy person. Graham felt something dangerous move quietly through his stomach, while several investors near the back began whispering openly now. Because for the first time that evening, it no longer looked like Graham Sterling was controlling the room. It looked like Celeste Harper was allowing him to participate in it. The tension inside the ballroom changed completely after the $70 million bid. Moments earlier, the Harrington auction had felt elegant, controlled, almost theatrical in its luxury. Now it felt dangerous in the quiet way only wealthy rooms could become when power started shifting publicly. Nobody cared about the champagne anymore. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. Even the waitstaff moved more carefully between tables, as if they sensed something larger unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Graham Sterling kept his expression composed with visible effort, while every instinct inside him screamed that he could not afford to lose. Not tonight. Not in front of investors already questioning Sterling Group behind closed doors. Raise it, Eleanor whispered beside him without moving her eyes from the stage. If you back down now, people will remember. Graham swallowed slowly before lifting his paddle again. $75 million. A low murmur spread. Immediately across the ballroom, several guests exchanged stunned looks. One private equity chairman leaned toward another and whispered something while glancing openly toward the Sterling table. Graham noticed every reaction. Good. Let them see confidence. Let them see strength. Across the aisle, however, Celeste Harper remained perfectly calm. No tension in her shoulders. No sign she had entered a financial battle. She simply rested one arm lightly against the velvet chair while studying the painting projected above the stage as though the entire room existed several feet away from her emotionally. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses carefully. $75 million from Mr. Sterling. Do we have 80? Silence lingered for 2 long seconds. Graham almost felt relief beginning to settle back into his chest. Then Celeste finally lifted her eyes toward the stage. $90 million. Audible reactions spread instantly this time. Not dramatic gasps. Worse, controlled disbelief from people wealthy enough to understand exactly how large that number truly was. Vanessa turned sharply toward Graham now. This is insane, she whispered harshly. Nobody spends $90 million on a Rothwell unless they are trying to prove something. Eleanor's jaw tightened beneath the chandelier light. She is bluffing. But Graham no longer believed that. Bluffing required emotion, pressure, ego. Celeste showed none of them. She looked almost bored by the attention surrounding her. Across the ballroom, an older collector quietly lowered his bidding paddle altogether. Another investor leaned back in his chair with faint amusement, watching the Sterling family instead of the stage now. That shift terrified Graham more than the money, because powerful people had stopped viewing him as the center of the room. They were studying him the way financial circles studied vulnerability before collapse. Graham forced another smile despite the heat building behind his collar. $92 million. This time, before the auctioneer could even repeat the number, Eleanor leaned subtly closer to him. That is enough, she murmured sharply. We cannot go much higher without questions tomorrow morning. Graham ignored her completely. Across the ballroom, Celeste finally turned her attention toward him directly. Their eyes locked beneath the golden lights while silence spread once more between every table in the room. Then, unexpectedly, Celeste lowered her paddle. Several people blinked in surprise. Graham felt immediate relief surge through him. The auctioneer smiled carefully. $92 million going once. Graham straightened slightly. Going twice. Vanessa exhaled under her breath. Then a voice near the stage interrupted calmly. Excuse me. The entire ballroom turned toward the Harrington executive director stepping quickly beside the auctioneer, holding a black folder in one hand. He whispered something briefly before the auctioneer froze for half a second. Then the man looked directly toward Celeste with visible respect. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced carefully. Before we continue, Harrington International would like to formally acknowledge Miss Harper for tonight's extraordinary contribution to the Whitmore Preservation Collection. Confused murmurs spread instantly across the room. Graham frowned. Eleanor's expression hardened again. The executive director continued smoothly. As many of you already know, Miss Harper privately acquired controlling ownership of the Whitmore collection earlier this year. Complete silence crashed across the ballroom. Not polite silence. Shocked silence. Several collectors turned toward Celeste immediately. One investor near the back actually lowered his drink halfway to the table without realizing it. Because everyone in that room understood exactly what the Whitmore collection represented. Generational wealth. Museum influence. Political access. Legacy money on a level most corporations could never reach. Graham stared openly now while something cold moved through his chest. He slowly turned toward Celeste again just as the executive director added one final sentence. Which also makes Miss Harper the principal benefactor of tonight's auction. And suddenly every person in the ballroom understood the same terrifying truth at exactly the same moment. Celeste Harper had never entered the room as a guest. She had entered it as someone powerful enough to own part of the room itself. The rest of the ballroom no longer felt like an auction to Graham Sterling. It felt like a slow public unraveling happening beneath crystal chandeliers, while hundreds of wealthy strangers quietly watched him realize how little he truly understood about the woman he divorced. Conversations resumed eventually, but differently now. Softer, sharper. People no longer whispered about the Rothwell painting. They whispered about Celeste Harper, about the Whitmore collection, about why someone with access to that level of money and influence had once sat quietly at Sterling family dinners while Eleanor corrected her table manners like she was an outsider lucky to be invited into wealth. Graham barely heard the final hammer confirming the Rothwell sale. $92 million. His name attached to the winning bid. It should have felt like victory. Instead it felt expensive, dangerous, hollow. Across the ballroom, Celeste stood near the staircase speaking calmly with the Harrington Executive Committee while investors approached her one after another with visible respect. Nobody pitied her anymore. Nobody looked at her like Graham's ex-wife. They looked at her like someone whose approval mattered. Vanessa leaned closer to Eleanor with tension written clearly across her face now. "Mom," she whispered. "How could we not know about any of this?" Eleanor kept her posture rigid. Because she hid it. But even she no longer sounded fully certain. Graham finally stood from the table without excusing himself. He crossed the ballroom through clusters of collectors and executives who subtly stepped aside the moment they saw him approaching Celeste. That detail unsettled him too. People usually moved for Sterling family authority. Tonight they moved because they wanted a better view of the conversation. Celeste noticed him immediately, but showed no surprise. "You look tired," she said softly before he could speak. Graham stopped in front of her beneath the gold staircase lighting. "Who are you?" The question escaped more quietly than he intended. Celeste studied him for a moment. "That is an interesting question coming from someone who lived with me for 3 years." Graham lowered his voice further. "The Whitmore collection. Harper Holdings. Those accounts connected to Sterling Group." Her expression changed slightly at the last sentence. Not fear. Recognition. Graham noticed it immediately. "So it was you," he said carefully. Celeste glanced briefly toward the ballroom before answering. "You should be more specific." Graham felt frustration rising beneath the calm mask he had fought to maintain all evening. "The accounts stabilizing our losses. The shell corporations moving capital into Sterling projects before banks started pulling back. Someone protected the company." Celeste remained silent for 2 seconds too long. Then she looked at him fully again. "And now the company is struggling without those protections." The truth landed harder than Graham expected because deep down, he already knew she was right. Memories began rearranging themselves painfully inside his head. Small financial crises that disappeared overnight during their marriage. Investors who suddenly changed positions after private dinners Celeste attended quietly beside him. Contracts approved faster than expected whenever she reviewed them before meetings. At the time, he assumed Sterling influence handled everything. Now he realized something far worse. Celeste had been solving problems he never even noticed existed. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why help us at all?" For the first time all evening, something almost sad moved quietly through Celeste's eyes. "Because I believed marriage meant building together." Silence settled heavily between them. Around them, the ballroom continued glowing with wealth and music and quiet conversations, but Graham barely noticed any of it anymore. He was too busy recognizing pieces of his own life he had completely misunderstood. Before he could speak again, an older man in a dark tailored coat approached Celeste respectfully. "Miss Harper," he said, "the Zurich partners arrived early." Celeste nodded once. "I will join them shortly." The man glanced politely toward Graham before stepping back again. Graham watched the interaction carefully. Zurich. Partners. International capital. People who spoke to her like she belonged at the center of billion-dollar decisions. He suddenly remembered every moment his family treated her like she should feel grateful just to sit at their table. The humiliation of that realization settled slowly into his chest, while Celeste adjusted the diamond bracelet beneath the chandelier light. "There is one more thing you should know," she said quietly. Graham looked at her immediately. Celeste's voice remained calm. "The Sterling family does not actually own the debt controlling your Miami expansion anymore." His stomach tightened instantly. "Who does?" Celeste held his gaze for one long second before answering. "I do." And for the first time in his entire adult life, Graham Sterling understood exactly what it felt like to stand inside a room full of powerful people while realizing someone else held complete control over his future. The moment Celeste Harper walked away from him beneath the chandelier light, Graham Sterling understood something terrifying. Money was not the real source of power in rooms like this. Information was. And somehow his ex-wife had spent years standing beside him while understanding every weakness hidden beneath the Sterling family empire better than he did. Across the ballroom, the auction continued with polished elegance, but Graham no longer heard the auctioneer clearly. The music sounded distant now. Conversations blurred together beneath the weight building slowly inside his chest. He returned to the Sterling table where Eleanor immediately looked up from her champagne glass. "Well?" she demanded quietly. "What did she say?" Graham remained standing for a second too long before answering. "She owns the Miami debt." Silence hit the table instantly. Vanessa blinked once. "What?" Eleanor stared at him as if she misheard. "That is impossible." Graham finally sat down heavily beside them. "Apparently not." Eleanor's voice lowered sharply. "Then buy it back." Graham laughed once under his breath, but the sound carried no humor. "With what liquidity?" That answer shut the table silent again. Around them, several investors nearby pretended not to notice the tension while listening to every word anyway. Wealthy people always listen hardest when powerful families started cracking publicly. On stage, another major acquisition closed beneath applause, but attention inside the ballroom kept drifting back toward Celeste. She now stood near a private reception corridor speaking with 3 international banking executives, while members of the Harrington committee hovered nearby with careful attentiveness. Nobody interrupted her casually. Nobody treated her like decoration. Graham noticed that detail repeatedly. Respect at this level did not come from beauty or charm. It came from leverage. Vanessa leaned closer toward him with growing panic hidden beneath her polished appearance. "How much control does she actually have?" Graham loosened his collar slightly. "I do not know anymore." Across the ballroom, a younger investor approached the Sterling table carefully with an awkward smile. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "I wanted to congratulate you on securing the Rothwell tonight." Graham forced a polite nod. "Thank you." The man hesitated before adding, "Though I have to admit, I did not realize your former wife was connected to Harper Holdings." Eleanor's expression froze instantly. "Neither did we." The investor smiled carefully, though curiosity remained obvious in his eyes. "Remarkable woman. Very respected internationally." After he walked away, Eleanor finally set down her champagne glass harder than intended. "This is becoming embarrassing." Graham turned toward her slowly. "Embarrassing?" His voice remained controlled, but colder now. "You spent years treating her like she was lucky to marry into this family." Eleanor lifted her chin defensively. "Because she never acted like she belonged in our world." Graham looked across the ballroom toward Celeste again. "Maybe because she never needed to." The truth of that sentence settled heavily over the table. For the first time all evening, even Eleanor Sterling had no immediate response. Then another movement near the stage shifted the atmosphere once again. The Harrington executive director returned beneath the lights, holding a black velvet folder, while assistants moved quickly through the aisles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly, "before tonight concludes, Harrington International would like to formally recognize the completion of a private acquisition finalized moments ago inside the Zurich Partnership Division." Several heads turned immediately toward the private reception corridor. Graham felt tension tighten through him again. The executive director continued carefully. "The acquisition includes controlling redevelopment rights for the South Miami Harbor expansion project." Complete silence spread instantly through the ballroom. Graham's stomach dropped. That project represented Sterling Group's entire future growth strategy. Investors knew it. Bankers knew it. Everyone important in the room knew it. Slowly, beneath the attention of hundreds of wealthy eyes, Celeste Harper stepped calmly back into the ballroom. The executive director smiled respectfully toward her. "Congratulations, Miss Harper." Applause began carefully across the room. Not loud. Worse. Respectful. Real. Graham sat frozen while realization hit him piece by piece. The debt. The project. The timing. Celeste had not simply protected Sterling Group during the marriage. She had quietly positioned herself to control what remained after it. Vanessa whispered under her breath. Oh my God. Eleanor looked genuinely pale beneath the chandelier light now. Meanwhile, Celeste accepted a folder from the executive director with effortless calm before signing the final page in front of the room. Cameras flashed softly from the media balcony above while investors watched with open fascination. Then, without arrogance or celebration, Celeste closed the folder and lifted her eyes briefly toward the sterling table. No smile, no revenge speech, nothing dramatic at all. Somehow that made the humiliation feel even heavier. Because in that moment, Graham Sterling realized the most powerful person in the ballroom was not trying to destroy his family publicly. She simply no longer needed them at all. By the time the final auction closed, the ballroom no longer belonged to the Sterling family. It belonged to the quiet realization spreading from table to table that Celeste Harper had entered the room underestimated and was leaving it untouchable. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above the marble floors. Champagne still flowed between collectors and investors beneath soft music. But the energy had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, people watched Celeste with curiosity. Now they watched her with the kind of respect reserved for individuals capable of shifting financial landscapes without raising their voices. Graham Sterling remained seated long after the applause surrounding the final acquisition faded into conversation again. Across from him, Eleanor looked older somehow. Not physically, socially, like someone slowly understanding that status could disappear much faster than it was built. Vanessa checked her phone repeatedly, panic slipping through the polished confidence she usually wore so effortlessly. The market already knows, she whispered suddenly. Graham looked toward her. What? Vanessa swallowed hard before turning the screen toward him. Financial reporters, investor blogs, private market updates. Every headline carried the same story in different words. Harper Holdings secures Miami harbor rights. Sterling expansion future uncertain. Mystery investor connected to Harrington acquisition. Graham stared silently at the screen while pressure settled heavier against his chest with every passing second. Across the ballroom, meanwhile, Celeste stood near the grand staircase surrounded by museum directors, international financiers, and collectors eager for her attention. But unlike most powerful people in the room, she never tried to dominate conversations. She listened more than she spoke. She smiled politely without performing warmth. She carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed approval from anyone present. Graham noticed another detail too. Nobody interrupted her carelessly. People waited for pauses before speaking to her. That kind of respect could not be purchased overnight. It had to be earned quietly over years. Eleanor finally stood from the table with controlled dignity. We are leaving, she announced coldly. But before anyone moved, a familiar voice approached. From behind them, Mr. Sterling. Graham turned slowly to find one of the senior banking executives standing nearby, holding a tablet in one hand. The man offered a careful smile that barely disguised professional discomfort. I apologize for the timing, he said quietly, but after tonight's announcements, our board would like to revisit tomorrow morning's financing discussion. Graham understood immediately. Not canceled. Worse, reconsidered. The executive lowered his voice further. Particularly now that Miss Harper controls the harbor expansion rights. Then he stepped away politely before Graham could answer. Silence settled heavily over the Sterling table again. Vanessa looked close to tears for the first time all evening. Eleanor stared toward the ballroom floor with tightening lips while cameras flashed softly near the staircase, where reporters now surrounded Celeste with growing interest. Graham finally stood slowly from his chair. Go ahead, he said quietly to his family. I will meet you outside. Eleanor studied him carefully before leaving without another word. Once they disappeared into the crowd, Graham crossed the ballroom one final time. Not with arrogance anymore. Not even with anger. Just with the exhausted understanding of a man recognizing the exact moment his world stopped belonging to him. Celeste noticed him approaching before he spoke. You should not stay too long, she said softly. People are already watching the Sterling family differently. Graham looked at her for several seconds beneath the chandelier light. Did you plan all of this? He asked finally. Celeste considered the question carefully. No, she answered honestly. I planned my future. Your family simply decided I could never have one without you. The truth of that sentence landed harder than anything else she had said all night. Graham lowered his eyes briefly before giving a quiet laugh filled with regret instead of amusement. You know the worst part, he admitted softly. I thought I was the one giving you a life. Celeste's expression softened slightly then. Not enough to reopen old emotions. Just enough to acknowledge the sadness beneath the truth. That was your first mistake, she said calmly. Another silence passed between them while the ballroom glowed around them with money, music, and whispered conversations. Then an assistant approached Celeste quietly. Your car is ready, Miss Harper. She nodded once before turning back toward Graham. Goodbye, Graham. No bitterness. No revenge speech. No final humiliation. Just calm closure delivered with more dignity than anyone in his family had shown her. Graham watched as she descended the staircase beneath the golden lights while photographers gathered near the entrance and powerful people stepped aside to let her pass. Nobody laughed anymore. Not the investors. Not the collectors. Not the Sterling family. Because somewhere between the divorce papers and the auction floor, every person in that ballroom finally understood the same thing. Celeste Harper had never walked away from the Sterling family empty-handed. She had walked away with herself. And in the end, that turned out to be worth more than everything they owned.